Right, the next step is putting the mid plate on and then getting ready for the tail housing after we get our reverse slider gear and idler gear in place and our speedometer gear. All this has to go in before the tail housing, but the mid plate is next in order. And if you notice, I've got everything laid out. This is important that you have, because your silicone, you may run into something that will take you a little bit longer to figure out, or you might have a bolt that needs a different washer or something needs changing. You may run into a problem, but right now it's critical on having all your stuff laid out and clean. I've done wiped all this down, ready to silicone. I've got my bolts clean and laid out. I made sure that all the nuts were the correct threads and all the lock washers and washers look good, so that when you start the case height on, get started with the silicone, that this proceeds on pretty quickly to where the silicone doesn't have a chance to set up before you get done. And this part with the tail housing is probably right now the most tedious, and we've just got to make sure that before the tail housing goes on, we've got to remember to put our little O-ring on the side, and it goes into that groove right there, because once we get the tail housing in place, this reverse cam will have to tap over so that the reverse fork picks up the flange on the slider gear. So like I say, main thing is having everything laid out and clean and having your tools ready to where that once you start, we can move on with the process. Now I'm going to glue up the back of the case, put the mid plate on, and then we'll put our reverse idlers and sliders and speedometer gear on. All right, I slid my mid plate on and I marked the areas where the silicone goes to and where it doesn't go, so you just don't waste a lot of silicone, or you end up getting it. I get it all over everything anyway. And I marked my mid plate, the areas that don't get glue, and that's around the area where the reverse idler gear runs. And then there's a wider area on the other side. So I'll just make sure that I don't get into that area. And then this thing has a hole in the main case, no hole in the mid plate. I would imagine that they might have done that as a drain back hole and didn't feel like it was necessary to complete that. So that's what I'm going to guess it is, or they may have had another application that needed a drain back hole and this one doesn't have it. But I just glue inside the areas. I also took a die grinder and notched the mid plate, because there's no way to get in there and get this mid plate loose once you glue it in place. And I noticed that there were several places around this that they had used a chisel or a screwdriver, and I can put a couple of slots in it and make it a whole lot easier to get this mid plate off once we glue it. And then if you have to go back in and do any service, it makes getting this mid plate off so much easier. I'm going to finish gluing this up, and then we'll slide the mid plate in place and be ready to move on with our assembly. All right, got my mid plate glued up, and I've got glue on my end of my main case. Now lining up the bolts. Also, you have to line up the sleeve here for the reverse idler that it runs on. And this gets a little bit tricky at times, because sometimes the bolt alignment isn't exactly right. It is close, but it needs just a little help getting on. All right, that gets our mid plate in place. Now the next order of business will be our reverse idler and our thrust washers and our slider gear. The first thing I'm going to do is put a little bit of oil on this pin that the reverse idler runs on, because it's got a pair of Torrington bearings. First, we have to do our thrust washer though. The thrust washer goes on each side of this gear. And this is a little bit of white lithium grease. You can use Vaseline. I wouldn't recommend wheel bearing grease or anything like that, because the melt away temperature of that stuff have to get it so hot for it to melt away. I put the little thrust washer in. Now I can load the shaft with the Torrington bearings. Oil on this. This is your reverse idler gear. Put oil on it. And the teeth have to face out. The taper and the teeth face out, because your slider gear is going to come back and contact. Slider gear also has teeth that are cut back on one side, and this is the way that it'll go into reverse. Once you move the shift cam, then it moves this gear and matches this gear, which turns your cluster and turns it opposite direction for the main shaft. Now that we've got our slider gear on, and remember, this is what our cam is going to go into once we get our tail housing in place. But right now we're going to go ahead and get the speedometer gear. I'm going to go ahead and excuse me, and put the O-ring on our shift cam, because this will have to be tapped into place before we get our tail housing in place. And that just rolls on. You just want to make sure that it's straight. And I like to see if it'll turn, because then that way I know that there's not a roll in the snap ring to cause it to leak. But even if it did leak, we can replace that snap ring even when we get it in the car. As long as we can get to our taper pin, then we can replace that O-ring without a lot of problem. After the slider gear goes on, we have the snap rings that hold the speedometer gear in place. We'll put this one on. Yes, if we can find it. That's a good thing about snap ring pliers. All right, that one's in place. Our speedometer gear. And now our other snap ring. I like to see if the other snap ring will go into position before I put it on the shaft. It seems like it will. I like to put it on just to make sure that we don't have a issue where the snap ring might be a little bit too thick. I like to use some of the thinnest snap rings that I have to do this. And that one went into place and it is closed up, and it is the way it should be. Now our reverse gear can't come back any further than this. So now we're going to get ready to put the tail housing, which I'll have to glue. And you notice the marks around my mid plate. I marked this thing where I know where silicone would go on this side, so that we don't put it in areas that we don't need to put it in. Like I said, just to save a little bit of silicone, or to keep it from being everywhere on everything. Now I'm going to oil the fork and put it into the shift cam on the tail housing. And I've also got to put in this other thrust washer. Remember, we've got one behind the idler gear and we've got one on the tail housing. So make sure that you put these in, and make sure that these things have a tab to keep them from turning, and just make sure your tab fits the slot that's in the tail housing and that it is seated all the way around. Very important. We've got our tail housing. I've got this is one of two gaskets on this transmission, the tail housing to the mid plate, as well as our gasket. If we use Richmond Gear's front bearing retainer, there's a gasket up there. But there's a gasket back here on the back. I think you could do this thing without a gasket if you siliconed it, but I had a gasket. It's an older gasket, so I siliconed both sides of the gasket because it's an older gasket. I want to make sure it wasn't dried out and would not seal. So I went ahead and glued it. I've got glue on both sides of not only the gasket, but the tail housing. Now we're going to get ready to slide this tail housing in place. We've got all our reverse gear in place. I pulled a slider gear back as far as it's come to me. The fork is in the tail housing. It's also, the fork, it is as far forward so I can make sure that I can get this thing into position and kind of see through the window here as it goes into place. My thrust washer is in place. I have put oil around my rear bushing and seal, and I'm ready to slide this on. I have my taper pin. I've got my bolts, nuts, washers, and I've got this to where that we put it in place, tap the cam up to move the cam over into position to lock into our flange, and then we can bolt up this assembly. And I do this to where the fork lays over on the side to where that it is down to where that it stays in position and doesn't fall out of the tail housing. This usually works better for me when I try to do this. And I find that I've got it locked in, and I can tap the shift cam over to where that it doesn't unlock as we're finishing putting this in position. All right, and you'll have to turn this a little bit to get the gears to line up as you move it forward into position. And there's our tail housing in position. And right now is a good time to make sure that this thing shifts into reverse and out of reverse, because right now we are in reverse, and we want to make sure that this thing is in position and we don't have to do anything before we take it apart. Before we bolt it together. All right, that should be neutral, and it is. The tail shaft, I can hold it and turn the input, and then when I put it back into reverse, then it turns opposite of the input. So we know that we've got that in position, and we can put our taper pin in after we get our bolts in place. I've already siliconed the threads because this bolt goes to fluid, so we need to make sure that we have silicone on it. Then all we do is put our washers and our nuts in place. And when you lay all this stuff out, when you're assembling, make sure that your threads in the locking nuts are good, and even in your bolt that you put in, and make sure it's the correct thread. Because I have seen this before where you get ready to put it together and you may or may not have picked up the wrong bolts, nuts, and you start to put it together and it doesn't go, and you mess up a thread and have to go back and either replace a stud or do repair work to aluminum threads where you've run a bolt in that's the wrong thread, so be careful. I'm going to finish snugging this up, then we'll come back and put our taper pin in, and then we'll torque this thing up. May torque it, then put the taper pin in. All right, I've got my side on, my front bearing retainer on, my tail housing on. I've already torqued. It's torqued. The sequence was I snugged the side cover and then I put the front bearing retainer on, so it kind of evened up the case at the front, snugged this, went to the back, glued it, and snugged the tail housing on to where the case is in alignment. I snugged the tail housing, then I came back and I torqued all of the bolts that holds the side together. I torqued them in a sequence, and it's much, you can do it however you want to do it, but I do it kind of in an offset pattern. I may start in the center and work out, or I can do a cross like you do a cylinder head, but as long as you start easy and keep pulling each one and go deeper on your torque and end up with the torque specs for the size bolt, whether it's 5/16 or 3/8. Then I came to the tail housing and did the same thing. I snugged them on up evenly and crossed my torque sequence and got my tail housing tight. Now everything is together, torqued, and you can see the ribbon of silicone that comes out from these things where you put it together, and I like to see that. Then I know that this thing should be sealed up and not leak. Now I'm going to turn this thing up on its side and put the taper pin and the reverse backup switch in. That's really about all we lack, other than finding out what kind of front bearing retainer we're going to run. And I'm going to leave this just as it is right now. I won't have to worry about that because that's an easy thing to decide, is which you're going to run, whether it's a hydraulic or whether it's a mechanical. Doesn't really matter. And you got a gasket with one, or you check it to make sure that you don't seat that thing and there's a gap between the front bearing retainer and the case. Then you need a gasket, otherwise it'll fit all the way up to the case and you just seal it with silicone. But we'll get it up on its side, put the taper pin in. We'll get it up on its top and get the taper pin in. All right, this is the hole where the taper pin goes. And I've already tapped it in to where this lines up. And all we need to do now is I'll put a little bit of silicone on this taper pin, because the way it is that whenever this thing goes into place, I don't really want to hammer it in because it makes it extremely hard to get out. So since this is a tapered pin, I'll put just a little bit on the bottom of it, and as it goes through, it will seal in the bottom. And I just put it in. I use a round pin to get down on this and just snug it into place. It doesn't have to be extremely tight because you want to be able to get it out. But a lot of times what I do once I get it seated in place is I will silicone it in place. Then that way it doesn't come out, and I'm able to get it out if I want to get it out at a later time. Makes it a whole lot easier. The only thing left to do now is our reverse backup light switch, which goes in the bottom of this. I've already put silicone on the threads. We screw this in and tighten it. Our trans should be just about complete. And this doesn't have to be very tight because we've got silicone on the threads and we're going into aluminum. So we've just got to be careful that we don't strip the aluminum. Now let's check and see if we've got first and second. Should be able to shift back for first, forward for second. Get that back into neutral. Third, fourth, fifth, and sixth. So we've got all our gears. We know we've got reverse. We've got everything torqued. We've got everything checked over. Everything looks good. This tran's ready to install. And don't forget to put grease in. That's very, very important. Read the manual, and a lot of these use a 80-90 weight is what the manual looks like it recommends. These things are pretty fragile, so whatever you put it in, gears are a little bit narrow in them, so just be careful with these things. I've worked on a lot of these, and it seems like gears are the weakest part in them, and just be easy with them, and I think they'll last you a long, long time. If you have any questions, I'm Dan Elliott, 706-265-9999. I've got a decal here somewhere. And also, too, if you've got any questions about this, give me a call. If you've assembled one or you have problems with one, give me a call. I don't mind. And then also, too, even if you've got a T10 or a Tremec TKO 500 or 600 or a Ford top loader, just give me a call. Thank you for watching the video.
Like and subscribe.
Yep, if you would like and subscribe, I'm going to try to get some more videos up. I appreciate you watching, and hope that you have picked up something that's going to help you in your build of your TKO, of your, of your Richmond 6-speed. Thank you.